Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about deities and mythology. While I'm personally not a religious man, I do at least understand both how and why religions and myths come about. Broadly, they exist as a way for people to give meaning and understanding to the world, where there may not otherwise be, from the creation of the very universe and humanity and everything that we see today, down to very small events and oddities that we just have no clear explanation for. Religion and mythological stories of all manner and belief and custom try to provide some answers. These answers can be as simple as this guy, we'll call him God, he made everything, to a bunch of different deities sprang forth out of basically nothing, and they created more deities and even more deities, and each of these deities have different qualities and whatnot, and etc. Quite frankly, some religions and myths have way more interesting and also needlessly elaborate stories than others. For example, while I do find Roman and Greek mythology both incredibly entertaining and quite bizarre, I'm probably not going to sit down and learn all of it because there's only so much time in a day. I guess I'll just play some God of War and glean what I can off of that. But aside from these larger-than-life deities that have major responsibilities and roles, the kind of mythological being that I find more entertaining is the smaller, more niche deity, the lesser beings, or just the ones that are more weird, for lack of a better word. A good example of this is the entire sort of class of yokai from Japanese folklore and myth. From the weird turtle-looking creatures called kappa to a person with a really long neck in the Rokurokubi. The being that I want to focus more on today, though, is more deity than just odd creature, but it does have a weird story and a very fitting connection to today's subject. I'm speaking of the deity known as Shoki. Originating from Chinese mythology as Zhong Kui, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the deity became part of Japanese mythology under the name of Shoki. After all, a good deal of Japanese culture does borrow from Chinese culture, so it makes sense that this deity would follow over as well. The story of Shoki is of a medical student. Shoki dreamed of being the emperor's physician, and he appeared to be well on his way during his studies and education, becoming one of the best and highest scoring students. One of the final steps in becoming the emperor's physician was an interview with the emperor himself, and the emperor would reject Shoki on the basis that he was hideously ugly. I mean, we've all been there, am I right? Who among us? But being rejected, Shoki was so distraught that he apparently then bashed his head against the emperor's castle gates until he died. After his death, the emperor became horribly ill and was tormented by demons in his dreams. Then one night, in his dreams, he was visited by a man who vanquished the demons, and this man gave the name of Shoki. The emperor woke up the next morning and was miraculously cured. This led to Shoki becoming a sort of demon-hunting deity, a figure that is used to scare away and protect one from demonic or evil entities. And as it happens, Shoki was also the name of a Japanese aircraft in World War II, and in a different sense, that aircraft would have the role of repelling demons that were attacking Japan. This is Japan's demon-slaying Interceptor. This is the Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki. The story of the Ki-44 begins around 1939-1940, in conjunction with two other projects that began roughly around the same time. Building up and modernizing their stock of combat aircraft, the Japanese military sought improved fighters, both more traditional low and medium altitude fighters and high altitude interceptors. Essentially, it's like the former would be expanding the Japanese homeland horizontally, and the latter would be defending it vertically. In the former role, the company Nakajima would design the Ki-43 Hayabusa, also known as the Army Zero, due to its overall performance and design being pretty similar to the A6M0 used by the Japanese Navy. Its career would be relatively similar to the Zero as well, performing very well early in the war, but due to a lack of armor and improving Allied aircraft, it would gradually lose its effectiveness. For the latter role, Mitsubishi would be tasked with creating their J2M Raiden design, a design that we've talked about on this channel before, and Nakajima would be tasked with creating their own Interceptor that would either complement or compete with the Mitsubishi design. Much like the Mitsubishi design, as the aircraft role would be of an Interceptor, the general design of Nakajima's plane would go against the general grain of Japanese aircraft design. Instead of being a small, lightweight plane that focused far more on maneuverability, the Nakajima and Mitsubishi designs would instead focus on being small, lightweight planes that focused more on climb rate and top speed. Specifically, the Japanese military requested a plane that would reach an altitude of 13,125 feet in under 5 minutes, with a top speed at that altitude at or above 373 miles an hour, and with an armament of two 7.7mm machine guns and two 12.7mm machine guns. To these specifications, Nakajima would create their Ki-44 design, a plane that was smaller dimensionally than the Ki-43 and J2M Raiden, and just slightly heavier than the Ki-43. Measuring in at 8.8 meters long, 9.45 meters wide, and 3.25 meters tall, the Ki-44 was a teardrop-shaped plane with short, wide wings and a small cockpit canopy. Powering the Ki-44 was to be one of the stronger Japanese engines at the time, and Nakajima was able to stay in-house with the Nakajima Ha-41, an improved version of the Nakajima Ha-5, a 14-cylinder radial engine. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of it, but it looked relatively similar to another Nakajima engine in the Sakae, the engine the Ki-43 and A6M0 used. The Ha-41 engine was slightly wider than the Sakae, which resulted in the wider nose and general teardrop shape of the Ki-44, but with 1,250 horsepower, the Ki-44 in 1940 would have a lot more power behind it than just about any other Japanese aircraft at the time. Granted, 1,250 horsepower doesn't sound like terribly a lot, and it kind of isn't, but for a plane that had a gross weight between 5,600 pounds and 6,000 pounds, that power was pretty solid. The construction of the first prototype Ki-44 would go much smoother than its sister project, the J2M, and by August 1940, a year and a half before the first flight of the J2M, the Ki-44 would take to the air, and the initial flight testing showed an overall mixed bag of an aircraft. Flying at the time without its armament, on the positive side, the Ki-44 handled decently well, although it had much poorer maneuverability for your average Japanese fighter, which made it a more challenging plane to fly for Japanese pilots. But if you ignore that factor for now, overall it handled fine. The in-flight view from the cockpit was solid as well, and the performance compared to other Japanese fighters was very good. However, moving over to the negatives, the performance was still not up to the requested specs, and the top speed was 31 miles an hour below what was requested, sitting at just 342. And with this reduction in top speed, the climb rate was also well below what was requested. Furthermore, even with the installation of so-called butterfly combat flaps that would improve maneuverability, the overall maneuverability of the Ki-44 was something that a lot of Japanese pilots would seemingly never become accustomed to. And because the wings were shorter and smaller overall, the Ki-44 had a higher wing loading, which meant that it had much higher takeoff and landing speeds. Combine that with poor cockpit visibility while on the ground, with the pilot being blocked by the larger nose, the Ki-44 was simply not a fun plane on or near the ground. The speed and climb issue would be somewhat remedied through some modifications made to the cooling system and engine cowling, and the top estimated speed of the Ki-44 when the armament would eventually be installed sat at around 360 miles an hour, still below the original specifications, but nonetheless excellent for a Japanese single-engine fighter. At some point in the Ki-44's testing run, the prototype would be matched head-to-head with the Kawasaki Ki-60 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109E, a plane that was imported in from Germany. The Ki-60 was kind of like the Japanese version of the Bf-109, in that it used either an imported Daimler-Benz DB601 engine or a Japanese licensed copy. Going up against both of these designs, the Ki-44 would prove itself to actually be overall the superior plane, and during the time of its prototype testing, the eventual top speed of 360 miles an hour would actually be the peak of Japanese single-engine fighters. Normally, this would give the Ki-44 a one-way ticket to mass production and fame, but actually this speed performance was still a bit underwhelming, considering that another plane, the Mitsubishi Ki-46, a twin-engine recon plane that would later be converted into night fighter and interceptor variants, actually had a higher top speed than the Ki-44. Still though, the Ki-44 project would continue, and after 9 or 10 pre-production and prototype planes were shipped over to some Japanese units based in China for some combat testing, it would eventually be accepted for service and full-scale production by September 1942, and it was given the full name of Army Type II Single-Seat Fighter Model 1 Shoki. Now, the given name of Shoki for the Ki-44 was a very fitting name, given that it was to be a high-altitude interceptor, given that it would be taking out enemy bombers that would be flying over Japan attacking Japanese cities. Those bombers would be the quote-unquote demons that the Ki-44 would be defeating and repelling. I also do think the general idea of the strategic bombers attacking Japan being more demonic than your other standard fighters makes sense, as those bombers would inevitably be hitting civilian targets, a more demonic act. So just as Chinese and Japanese citizens use the Shoki to ward off evil and those that wish to harm, the Ki-44 would play the same role, but for the country of Japan itself. Because of this more poetic naming, at the very least, the Ki-44 is probably one of the most well-named planes of World War II. But back to the actual plane itself, now officially in production and service, the initial production design, or designs plural, had a rather brief career. Between the 3 sub-variants of the first model, the 1A, 1B, and 1C, a grand total of just 40 of them were made. The 1A was basically just the approved and accepted prototype, while the 1B would alter the armament to 4 12.7mm machine guns, and the 1C was basically just the 1B with very slight changes to the landing gear. With these initial Ki-44-1 models, there wasn't some newfound problem that forced some new improvements or anything of that matter, but rather it was just Nakajima and the Japanese Air Force wanting more out of the design. This also has to make you wonder, though, why the Ki-44-1 was ever approved in the first place, if they were only going to make 40 of them before making an entirely new model. But whatever, I guess somebody was being stupid that day, and in an effort to improve performance and bring the original specs to reality, they would need a stronger engine. Normally, this would necessitate a good deal of redesigning, as not all engines are created alike, and even engines with similar sizes may have different little design quirks and whatnot. But for the new Ki-44 engine, they would basically use the exact same engine, with some minor improvements that made it more powerful. Out would go the Ha-41, and in would go the Ha-109, an engine with 1,450 horsepower in the exact same lineage as the Ha-41 and earlier Ha-5, basically being the same exact size as the Ha-41. Putting the Ha-109 in the Ki-44 frame was incredibly easy. This meant that there was basically no delay in producing and delivering the new Ki-44-2 model, and this one as well would have 3 subvariants in the A, B, and C models. The 2A was basically the same as the 1A, just with the bigger engine. The 2B model was basically the same as the 1C, and also the 1B technically, since the 1B and 1C were just about the same, but the 2B had the larger engine as well. Then for the 2C, there would actually be a notable difference this time over some of the previous models, with an assortment of different armaments. The baseline 2C model would be fit with 4 20mm cannons, a pretty significant boost over the 4 12.7mm machine guns, and such an armament would be more befitting a high-altitude interceptor and/or bomber-destroyer. A lesser number of 2C models would be fit with some even stronger guns, having a pair of 12.7mm machine guns and either a pair of 40mm cannons or a pair of 37mm cannons. The 40mm cannons, while certainly powerful, only held about 10 rounds apiece, and they had a very short range, so that one was seldom used, and the 37mm was much more common. However, the 37mm itself wasn't terribly common either, and most 2C models that were made were fit with just the 20mm cannon armament. Of all of the Ki-44-2 models, the 2B was far and away the most common, and between all 3 of its variants, over 1,000 would be produced in total. As the Ki-44-2 models would increasingly make their way to Japanese units, in late 1942 and into 1943, they would actually receive a very cold reception from Japanese pilots, while the Ki-44s now were pretty solidly performing with a new top speed upwards of 376 miles an hour and a climb to 16,000 feet at just 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The overall reduced maneuverability made the pilots that were more experienced with highly agile aircraft much more uneasy and just unhappy, while ideally the more experienced Japanese pilots would be able to better handle the more demanding Ki-44. The exact opposite actually turned out to be true. As the war progressed and less experienced Japanese pilots entered the fray and replaced the now deceased, more experienced pilots, their lack of experience actually proved to be a benefit when they were flying the Ki-44, as they wouldn't be used to the lighter and more agile controls of your more common Japanese fighter. Flying the Ki-44 wouldn't be as much of a culture shock, so to speak, and flying chiefly out of mainland Japan, and in smaller numbers out of China, Malaya, Burma, and Indonesia, the Ki-44 ended up proving itself to be a solid bomber destroyer. While unfortunately I could not find statistics on the number of confirmed kills and losses with the Ki-44 just using context clues, I would have to assume that they were roughly close to being equal, which, as the war shifted against Japan past mid-1942, that would actually be a pretty solid record, all things considered. With excellent speed and an excellent rate of climb, the Ki-44 would ideally be able to efficiently conduct some hit-and-run attacks, quickly climbing, striking, and leaving before the Allied escort fighters really had a chance to do anything. However, during its career, the Ki-44 was also noted, much like a lot of other Japanese aircraft, to have very poor armor, and thus would be very easy to destroy, and it mainly using 12.7mm machine guns was rather underpowered for a bomber destroyer. And again, while its speed was great for a Japanese fighter, as Allied escorts like the P-51D would increasingly make their presence felt, the Japanese military elected to start pulling the Ki-44 from more active frontline roles in favor of the Ki-84, a fighter with greater speed, greater maneuverability, and a greater average armament. Nakajima would attempt to improve upon the Ki-44-2 with the Ki-44-3 models that had a 2,000 horsepower engine and a greater average armament. However, as the Ki-84 would go on to be regarded as one of Japan's best planes made during the entire war effort, and the Ki-44-3 models just wouldn't match it, by late 1944, the production of the Ki-44 would cease in favor of the Ki-84, with total production numbering just over 1,200. Even though the Ki-44 started to be pulled from frontline use, they would see some notable use towards the end of the war, with some units based out of Tokyo engaging in kamikaze attacks with them. These attacks, though, were not like your typical kamikaze, where the plane is loaded with explosives and rammed into an enemy ship, but instead they were basically just normal Ki-44s engaging with enemy bombers, and at some point in combat, the Ki-44 would then just try to ram itself into the attacking bomber, as a sort of last gasp. These kind of aircraft in this role were moderately effective, but they simply didn't number enough to make any sort of significant impact. So overall, did the Ki-44 defeat the demons attacking Japan? Directly, no, not really, but indirectly, yeah, kind of. While the Ki-44 was pretty solid against Allied bombers flying over Japanese land, they weren't amazingly effective, or some kind of superplane or anything of that nature, and there simply weren't enough of them. They were able to take out a number of demons, but ultimately those demonic forces were just too powerful, and our boy Shoki would fall. But I guess in the indirect sense, because the Ki-44 wasn't a game-changing plane, the Allies would win, and defeated Imperial Japan, the militarist, authoritarian, fascist or fascist-adjacent state, and defeating such a power and the Axis powers was overall pretty neat if I do say so myself. I would consider the Axis powers to be pretty bad, perhaps evil or demonic you could say, and so in a very backwards way, the Ki-44 not being good enough helped it stay true to its name and defeated the demon that was the Axis powers. So I thank you for your service, Mr. Shoki. Now you may rest. You must have a terrible headache. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. For some Japanese gods and whatnot, did you know that they have a god of poverty called Binbogami? I only know about this because there's an anime called Binbogami Ga, where a girl has a lot of luck and fortune, and the poverty god wants to take it away from her. Pretty solid anime, it has a good dub as well, and I would recommend it, even though it's been many years since I've actually seen it. Now, do you want a good anime about World War II? Watch Barefoot Gen, it's very depressing. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.